Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. ICW community, inshallah, today we will learn about feminism and how it was inhibiting Sister Nour Juda's ability to come back to Islam. Myself being a father of three daughters, with the oldest being a freshman at Glenbard West, Go Hilltoppers, this is an especially relevant topic. Sister Nour, Bismillah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم نعوذ بك من علم لا ينفع ومن قلب لا يخشع ومن نفس لا تشبع ومن دعوة لا يستجاب لها اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وقنا عذاب النار. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. For those of you who've been with us for the last couple of weeks, welcome back. Those of you who are new, Assalamu alaikum, great to have you. So we're going to spend today, inshallah, and the following session talking about feminism. And the first thing that I want to do is kind of go through a few disclaimers and set the stage. So please bear with me. First thing I want to do is talk about how we are going to define this term. And that's really, really important because depending on who you are speaking with, they may have a slightly different definition for what this term means. So in doing my research and homework over the last, let's say, 5 or so years after coming back to Islam, I have learned that even feminists can't agree on a definition for this term, and that this term and its definition are constantly changing. But the common denominator seems to be equal rights for men and women. This is the only part of the definition of this term that seems to be the same throughout time. So we're just going to go ahead and use this very simplistic definition for feminism: equal rights for men and women. Okay, so that's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is that no matter where you are regarding this topic or issue, no matter what your opinions are about it, one thing we should agree on as Muslims, as brothers and sisters in Islam, is that we abide ultimately by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's tenets as they are given to us in the Quran, and through the lived example of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Which is to say that as we are having this conversation today, please try and recognize where the values and premises and axioms that I'm going to be talking about, where they're coming from. Are they Islamic, or do they belong to a different ideology, a different worldview, if you will? The third disclaimer is about that term, worldview. So throughout today's talk, I'm going to be referring to Islam and the Quran as a worldview. You'll hear me saying the Quranic worldview or the Islamic worldview. Now, I use that term for the sake of simplicity. I am not using the term worldview in reference to Islam and the Quran to suggest that the Quran and Islam itself are human constructs, that they are man-made. That is not what I am suggesting. I'm only using that term for the sake of simplicity and to help us understand how the Quran stands apart from other man-made worldviews. Okay? The last term that hopefully you're already familiar with is the term secular or secularism. Secularism is an ideology that ultimately has to do with the separation of religion from public society. Oftentimes we've learned about this in school as the separation of church and state. The fact that the word church is being used suggests that this is an ideology, a human, man-made philosophical movement and political movement that began not in the Muslim world, but in the Western world. And today, as Muslims, it affects us in the very same ways that feminism affects us and why we are talking about feminism today. So, with secularism, we are talking about religion as something that is only to be practiced in the privacy of one's home. It has no place in public life, in the workforce, in schools, in anything outside of your home, basically. And it furthermore embodies the notion that there really isn't a higher power to whom human beings are accountable. So secularism is laden with atheistic concepts. That's kind of the premise upon which secularism thrives. Okay? It's an atheistic worldview. All right. So the last thing I wanted to say before we get into the meat of the talk, inshallah, is the following. Many, many, many sisters in our community, and brothers as well, but mostly sisters, in the global Muslim community, have very serious and often valid grievances against our male counterparts. And that is why many of us resort to feminism. If we take the definition that I shared at the beginning, equal rights for men and women, many Muslim sisters will say, well, what's wrong with that? That is in line with Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to judge us not based on our gender, but based upon our deeds. So, isn't that what equality means between men and women? And the simple answer is no, it isn't. And we'll see today how they are different. But I just want to say that because I am critical of feminism, that does not mean that in any way I am suggesting that women across Islam and outside of Islam don't have valid reasons and valid grievances that they are trying to deal with. And I understand that many of us turn to feminism as a solution for those grievances. But unfortunately, that has done more harm than good for us. Okay. So let's go ahead now and talk about feminism. It's important to note that feminism as a movement had nothing to do with Muslims, nothing to do with Islam to begin with. Why? Because when Islam was revealed to our beloved Prophet alayhi salam, inherent in that revelation were the ways in which men and women were to fulfill their rights and responsibilities to themselves and each other. And in so doing, Muslims were able to combat, to deal with the issues of inequality, or I should say injustice, against women. As we all know, there were many, many injustices against women before Islam in the Arab world. And when Islam was bestowed upon us, Islam came and eradicated those injustices in very revolutionary ways, I might add, in ways that were way beyond that time period. Subhanallah. However, at the very same time, in the Western world, in Europe in particular, these dark ages that settled upon the European people, injustices against women continued to thrive, and they had their own sets of issues. What happens in Europe during that time period and afterwards is the people start to rise up and to say, we are not going to accept this anymore. Women should be treated with human rights and civil rights, etc., etc. And they have their own Western movements. Now, as you can tell, I'm kind of glossing over the history here. I'm not going into detail because of the time crunch that we have. But if you look at the banner below, you will see that there is a YouTube video title entitled Islam, Feminism, and Identity Politics. This is the long version of today's lecture. If you're interested in a more detailed explanation of what I am talking about, more history, and in-depth analysis, please go and watch that video on YouTube. Okay, so to continue where I left off, when Europe finally starts to address the issues and grievances of its women and it undergoes its own revolutions, Islam is on a different page. It's in an entirely different book. The Muslim world is elsewhere. We are way ahead of the game. Fast forward to today, after colonialism, after the Arab lands have been divided by Western powers, after the French and British have entered many Arab and Asian and Southeast Asian uh, lands and colonized the people. And with colonization has come a lot of brainwashing and indoctrination. And then fast forward even more to immigration. Many of us now live outside of our ancestral homelands. I myself grew up in the United States. I am as much American as I am Arab. I am as much American as I am Muslim today. I cannot tear that part of my identity outside of myself. I was educated in the public school systems of New York. I went to American universities. I absorbed American culture. English is my first language. And whatever your first language is, remember that language itself carries with it values and premises and axioms about truth and morality, what is normal and what is abnormal. Okay, and of course, many of these things are subjective. So, for those of us like myself who grew up in Western lands like the United States, Europe, Canada, we don't always realize, most of the time, we don't realize that we have absorbed Western ideologies and worldviews to such an extent that they dictate our behaviors, they dictate the way that we see the world. And even when we identify as Muslim, even when we embrace Islam and we do our best to practice as Muslims, we may take certain missteps without even realizing it. We may fall short without even realizing it. Because again, when it comes to where you grow up, the language that you grow up with, you carry out, you perpetuate, you continue forward the values of that particular culture. And feminism is no exception. Feminism is a value system. It is a particular way of envisioning, of perceiving, of seeing the roles of men and women. And nowadays, gender as a topic overall. So, why can't feminists agree on a definition for feminism? If you study the history of feminism, you'll learn that there have been several waves of feminism throughout time in the Western world. First wave feminism had its priority list of things it wanted to achieve. Second wave feminism had its priority list. Third wave, and apparently today we're undergoing a fourth wave, okay? If you want more details on that, again, please check out that YouTube video. The title is in the banner below, Islam, Feminism, and Identity Politics. Now, with each passing wave of feminism, yes, each wave built upon the previous movement, but it also changed significantly from its previous movement, okay? With first wave feminism, there was still a sense of difference between men and women when it came to, certain things that men could do and women couldn't do. There were certain responsibilities, let's say, that fell on the plates of men versus the responsibilities that women had to shoulder. The problem with second wave feminism, particularly for Muslims today, we are still feeling its effects, is the sexual revolution. That was the top priority of second wave feminism. It was the sexual revolution. So not only are women allowed to, work out in the public field, which Islam never took issue with in the first place, so that's something important to note. Notice how the West is still fighting for women to be able to work in the public sphere. Islam has never said to women, you cannot work in the public sphere. We know there are scholars and women who fought in battles. Islam simply has safeguards to protect women from the inherent issues that arise when genders mingle or when there isn't gender separation. The West was still trying to figure that out. And unfortunately, it took extremes in allowing women to essentially objectify themselves in many ways. They became very vulnerable to the opposite sex. So As we're growing up in our schools, as we're attending universities and colleges, we are seeing this on the public stage. We are seeing the way that it's totally normal for women to behave the way that they do, to speak the way that they do, to engage with the opposite gender in the way that they do. And we become desensitized to that at the same time. One of the things that was very profound to me when I was an undergraduate, and I went to a small liberal arts college in New England on the East Coast, very liberal university, very politically active. One of the things that was profound to me when it came to peers on campus who identified as feminists and who were majoring in feminism or gender and women's studies or whatever, title it was, is they seemed very, very fixated on the fact that there is an inherent problem, and that inherent problem is called the patriarchy. Having grown up in a Muslim household, as a Muslim born individual, even though I wasn't a practicing Muslim at that time, I was an atheist, I found it very ironic that I did not experience that. I didn't experience a quote unquote patriarchy in my lifetime. In fact, the men to whom I was exposed, my father, my uncles, my soccer coach, my teachers, yada, 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 these were people who I had genuine respect for. And these were people who didn't impress upon me the idea that I am a second class citizen because I am a woman, or that I should, know my place because I'm a woman. There were certain things that my father taught me as a Muslim that I was permitted to do and not permitted to do. But I never felt like I was inhibited or not allowed to do certain things or pursue learning or pursue scholarship because of my gender. That was never the case. And many of my peers on this college campus went around toting this idea. So for me, as an atheist at the time, I just never bought into the feminist ideology. Now, here's what's interesting. Even though I didn't necessarily identify as a feminist, even though I didn't go around, claiming to be a feminist or fighting for the feminist cause, I was still influenced by it. And this is the danger of ideologies and worldviews. This is the unconscious level at which they work. How was I influenced by it? Well, for one thing, I had imbibed or absorbed many of their axioms. What does that mean? Their premises, the things that they see as self-evident and true. For example, in our everyday lives, an axiom that nobody is going to disagree with or necessarily argue with is clouds are white, the sky is blue, many apples are red. I'm just giving you some very basic examples here. Every worldview has its axioms, the truisms, the things that it considers to be self-evident and true, upon which then other statements and ideas are built. So within the feminist framework, it is an axiom that a patriarchy exists, that men rule the world, have always tried to oppress women, have power, and have disempowered women. Now, if you take issue with that, then you take issue with feminism. Even though I didn't believe at a rational level that this was necessarily true, or at least let's say at the time I wasn't sure. Now I don't believe it. Having done my homework, I just don't believe that this is in the way that feminism presents the argument. It doesn't make sense. But at the time, I just wasn't sure that this was true based on my own personal experiences. I didn't believe that all men were inherently evil, for example, which is not to say that every feminist believes that, by the way. So even though I wasn't a part of that movement, I still acted in many ways in accordance with the way that women in the West choose to, or don't choose to, but just kind of by default behave, and the choices they make based on the effects of feminism. So, for example, I've already talked extensively about my experience as an atheist. much of that came from the freedoms, much of that came from the allowances that feminism has brought on. So to be able to, for example, you know, not wear hijab, to be able to mix with the opposite gender in ways that are unnecessary, to be able to, date, to be able to interact with the opposite gender in ways that Islam does not condone, is very much a part of the non Islamic and ultimately feminist worldview, right? That this is normal behavior, and that to not date, to not interact with the opposite gender is actually a sign of awkwardness, that something is wrong with you, that you are antisocial, or that you are oppressed as a woman, that your religion, your parents, your fathers, your patriarchy, is oppressing you. So hopefully that gives you a concrete example of how feminism can still impact you and how you can still be influenced by it, even if you don't identify as a feminist. Today, many sisters, particularly college-age sisters, as I've seen, speak out and interact in ways, even when wearing hijab, even when we are supposed to be outwardly modest, our tone of voice, our akhlaq, the way, and in certain contexts where it is not necessary, we speak to others, men and to women, males and females. We speak to others in ways that is very reminiscent of the feminist aesthetic. And I've already alluded to this a little bit. When you are taking gender and women's courses in college, one of the things you might find is this constant motif, this constant trend of very almost volatile and angry behavior towards the patriarchy, towards whatever perceived injustices are out there. And this is kind of a bigger conversation about identity politics itself, because it's not just feminism that does this, it's a lot of other movements, social justice movements, that do this too. But this goes against our teachings as Muslims, the way that we are taught to embody the example of the Prophet alayhi salam, the adab and the akhlaq with which he spoke to others, even under the most trying of circumstances, even when interacting with his enemies. He exhibited that sheer respect and humility and dignity. Whereas ideologies like feminism expect you to do the opposite. They train you to do the opposite, to be virulently angry constantly, and to bring out almost the worst parts of us as human beings, to encourage and nurture those attitudes that we are actually supposed to harness and to train and to deal with as human beings, as Islam teaches us. Are there any questions before I continue? I'll just give you a minute.
Okay, one question came in was, what do you think of the Me Too movement and versus the teachings of Islam?
Sure. So first off, we already know that in Islam, injustices of every kind are dealt with, or there are examples of these injustices that are dealt with in the Quran and in the Sunnah. So with the Me Too movement, it's obviously against Islamic principles. Obviously, what these women were subjected to and what they went through at the hands of men is impermissible, and in an Islamic dominated world, these perpetrators would have been dealt with in accordance with the Sharia. They would have had to suffer consequences that would have brought about justice. It is not necessarily wrong, I think, that these women spoke out. In many ways, I think they should have done so sooner than they actually did. But we have to acknowledge that every situation that we are in, we take some responsibility in. And this is where feminists have a very serious problem with people like myself when we say things like this. If I put myself in a dark alley in the middle of the night, okay, let's say I weigh 125 pounds and I am putting myself in a dark alley in a dangerous neighborhood, and I happen upon a group of men who are over 200 pounds, what do you anticipate my instinctual biological reaction is going to be within my body? Nervousness, anxiety, fear. These are safeguards that Allah puts in us. We don't have to think about those emotions that arise from being in a dangerous situation. So, those safeguards are there to protect us from situations like this. What happens with the Me Too movement is a consequence of women and men not listening to the safeguards that God has instilled within us. When we put ourselves in certain situations, vulnerable situations, we expose ourselves to certain crimes against our dignity and against our bodies, against our psychology, our psyches. So while the responsibility first and foremost rests on the laps of the perpetrators, the men who committed these crimes against these women also have to get to a point where they can critically self-reflect and look in the mirror and take responsibility for the situations that they put themselves in, whether that's in reference to this Me Too movement or otherwise, okay? When I used to work, I still work, but when I was in my 20s and I worked as an educator in certain capacities, I wasn't wearing hijab, I was still an atheist. I put myself in many, many, many undesirable situations with the opposite gender that could have ended very badly. And in reflecting, I can see where I could have done things differently. Now, if I could sit here and say, no, I could wear whatever I want, hijab or otherwise. Men need to learn to control themselves. I could sit here and take no responsibility and say, I have a fair shot at being at that work table as any other man. He should have controlled his tongue and not said what he said. Okay, sure, that's all fine and dandy, and there's truth there. Every human being is responsible for their own actions, and those men will have to answer to God one day. But so will I. I will also have to answer for certain things. Why was I not wearing hijab? I was out in the public. I wasn't in the privacy of my home. Why was I not dressed modestly? Why did I allow myself to engage in certain situations? Let's say I allowed a man to flirt with me, okay, which is not unlike the case in many of the Me Too examples. Why did you allow yourself to be behind closed doors with this person, or in a chat room with this person, or texting with that person? Do you see where I'm going with this? Ultimately, responsibility falls both ways. I
That's a
hope that
great
answers the
answer.
question.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah khair. What should our response be to sisters that say Islam promotes a patriarchal society?
Okay. My answer there is the same thing for, you could fill in the blank here and say, what what do you say to sisters who say that Islam promotes a blank society? And you could fill in that blank with almost any word. Put
Mhm.
feminism in there, put secularism in there, put anything and any ism in there. Number one, get clear on what the definition of that thing is. Okay, so when you're talking about patriarchy, what are you talking about? What do you mean by patriarchy? Through whose lens are you looking? If you want to look through the Western lens, your understanding of the patriarchy is going to be one thing. If you look through an Islamic worldview at what patriarchy means, you're going to come up with a completely different definition. Okay, and this is where this conversation gets really difficult, and I always have a hard time explaining it, so forgive me. I'm going to do my best. Worldview. When we say worldview, we are talking about a system of ideas, values, morals that all reinforce each other. Let's say Islam is a worldview. And by worldview, when I'm talking about Islam, once again, I'm not saying that it's man-made. Okay, this is the only, ultimate truth, divine revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Islam has certain values that all reinforce each other. right? They're all built upon the same concept. There's one God, he's the ultimate, creator, to him we belong, to him we shall return, etc., etc. When you're looking at a secular worldview, an atheistic worldview, it too has certain values and axioms and truisms that all build upon each other. Just one tiny branch of that entire system is feminism, and within it is the idea of a patriarchy. Now, think about the movie The Matrix, okay? When you're living in one worldview, one system, you see the world through a certain lens, and it all makes sense through that one lens. You take the pill, you're in a completely different other world now. And you see things that you could not see before because you're wearing a different set of lenses now, right? It's the same thing when you are dealing with competing worldviews. As a Muslim growing up in the West, I'm stuck in the middle, or we are stuck in the middle, where we can't seem to reconcile these things. So we come up with these questions of, is Islam patriarchal? Oh my God. If so, then it's evil. It must be wrong. It must not be true. We start to have this cognitive dissonance where we can't make sense of it. We are taught that patriarchy means men have all the power. Men tell women what to do. Women are confined to the private sphere where there is no power. You are powerless. All you do is cook, clean, and take care of kids, right? This is the way the West defines patriarchy and the gender roles that should be squashed and done away with. Whereas in the Islamic worldview, patriarchy doesn't even exist. This idea of a patriarchy doesn't exist. What exists? We have two genders, right? That complements one another, like yin and yang. We are each, let's say, 90% our dominant gender, and 10% of us has tendencies of the opposite gender, so that we can understand each other, right? So that we can relate to the opposite gender and make sense of things. Every gender, according to Islam, has its rights and its responsibilities. Men have certain things that they must do. Notice that if you really were to sit down and create a T chart, a compare and contrast, women have so much luxury and leeway in Islam, and men have a lot of heavy lifting to do in Islam. Not to scare the brothers here, but seriously, think about it. They are required to be on the front lines of wars. They are required to be the protectors of their homes. They have to work outside the home and inside the home. Okay? So not only are you to bring in the money and put food on the table, but you have to fulfill your duties as a husband and a father inside the home when you get home. You don't get a moment to breathe. Women are not required to work outside the home. Okay? If you so choose to do that and it doesn't interfere with your ability to tend to your children, right? And by tending to your children, I mean the most important job that any human being can fulfill, the most rewarding job any human being can fulfill, which feminism has changed the narrative about today, then that money is yours. You don't need to use that money to pay bills. That's still your husband's responsibility. Does he have that luxury? Absolutely not. Right? So I'm just going through some very simplistic examples, but really do your homework and do a comparison of the rights and responsibilities between genders here, according to the Quranic worldview. On the opposite end, in the Western world, we have accepted this very manipulative narrative that women should have the rights that men have. Okay, so I'm going to go work and I'm going to pursue a career and I'm going to get a PhD. But my biology, my fitra tells me I also want to get married and have kids. I also want that life. Okay, yeah, you can have it all, feminism tells you. Except what happens, at least in the United States. You bear children, you get a 3-month maternity leave if you have certain boxes checked off with your employer. You've worked there for a year, etc. Every employer has different things. You're there full time, you've fulfilled a certain number of hours. Then, after 3 months, you're ready to go back to work. Anyone who has had children knows that a 3-month-old is not ready to be parted from his or her mother. It is abusive to do that to a child, okay? And it's abusive to do that to a mother. That's why we struggle so much with mommy guilt and why so many mothers are bitter when they have to go back to work. And then they create these machines, these breast pumping machines, so that anybody can feed your child. You don't have to be the one to feed your child, right? Oh, and then you need to perform at top speed at the highest functioning level while you're at work. Never mind the fact that you've been up all night nursing your baby. Never mind the fact that your hormones are out of whack. Never mind the fact that you're still probably going through the postpartum, blues and all of that. And then you need to be a certain weight and you need to look a certain way and then you need to talk a certain way. I don't need to get into this. Women have joked about this for a very long time, but humor is based on truths, right? There's always truth in humor somewhere. This is what the West expects of women. You're going to go out there and you're going to work financially today. Most households can't live on one income. So even for women who want to stay home, who have woken up to the false narrative that feminism has sold us, they can't. It's too late because we bought into this ideology and it has us, choked at the neck where we have to both work now. Husband and wife have to work. Our children end up being raised and institutionalized by schools. They're being raised by nannies or babysitters who don't have the wherewithal to actually raise children. And we are out there basically perpetuating and feeding the economic system of the country that we live in. So, all of this to say, when you're defining the word patriarchy, look at the difference there, the consequences of the two. One leads to one set of consequences, the other one leads to another. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope that it starts to crack the ice on that question a little bit.
Yeah, that was great, especially when you said that Islam doesn't have a patriarchy, but instead we complement each other and we have that yin and yang, that
Mm-hmm.
image. Those words kind of really put it together. So jazakallah khair for that. I think that's. We do have one more question. Do you want to do it now or later?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. It is: can a practicing female Muslim identify herself as a feminist Muslim who stands for equal rights for all, including LGBTQ?
This is a great question. Jazakallah khairan for whoever asked that. So right now, if you're looking at the banner at the bottom, there are two women in our global community that I want you to become familiar with. One is Sister Zara Faris at zarafaris.com. The other is Sheikha Fatima Barakatullah. She's on Twitter. There's her handle. Go and check out their work. They address this very, very question, both of them. One of them has a video on YouTube, Does Islam Need Feminism? And the other one is can Muslims be feminists? And they reinforce some of the same ideas with one another, but they each have also other points that they make that are worth understanding and thinking about. So that's where I want to direct you, because those two sisters will do a much better job answering that question than I will. Okay?
Perfect. Okay. And then the last question for now is: we see a lot of voices among Muslim women who seem to have the idea of believing a purported female victim of abuse or even spiritual abuse without giving the due process to the entire situation. Is this also a result of feminism or something else?
Can you ask that one more time? I apologize.
Sure. So it's a long question. We see a lot of voices among Muslim women who seem to have the idea of believing female victims of abuse or even spiritual abuse without giving the due process to the entire situation. So they won't listen to both sides, I think is what the questioner was asking.
Yep. This is a result of identity politics. Okay, so watch that video that is linked down below
Okay.
or being scrolled. So we unfortunately are in the midst of a very dangerous era, and it's been brewing for quite some time. I know I started to feel its effects when I was in college, and that was between 2004 and 2008. So it's been brewing. And one person whose work you should look into is Professor Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. He has written and spoken about this very issue. Identity politics has amplified this concept of victimhood across all social justice movements, whether it's women's rights, the rights against, brown and black folks, the rights against Muslim, basically any group that has identified or currently identifies as a victim group. Identity politics makes it impossible for anyone, I literally mean anyone, even those with the most credibility or credentials, to speak out against their worldview. There's no room for debate when it comes to identity politics. So, for example, if I were to question in any way the notion that gender is not fluid, let me just say, let's take that. Let's take the LGBTQ movement. And let me just say, okay, as a Muslim, I don't believe that gender is fluid. I don't believe that people can be more than one gender or any gender beyond their biological sex. Let's just say I say something like that. And I premised it with I believe. Okay? Aren't we all entitled to our own beliefs? Isn't that part of the American, ethos? Isn't that part of democracy? Isn't that a part of everything we stand for in the West? Right? Or even in Islam. Lakum dinukum waliya din. At the end of the day, every human being is given free will by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Believe what you want to believe. And on the day of reckoning, Allah will be the ultimate judge. Well, identity politics comes in and says, nope, canceled. You are out. You lose your job. Professors are getting fired. People are getting fired from their jobs for attending such and such rally, for believing this or that, without due process. And so the question that, this person is bringing up is just a microcosm of a larger issue happening on the, I think, socio-political stage right now, which is that identity politics has hijacked all of us from the ability to debate issues. Okay? It has made it impossible for us to disagree agreeably, to take up issues and to say, well, hold on a second. This premise here doesn't quite make sense. Oh, you're a bigot. You're a racist. You're a misogynist for even questioning or doubting that. Right? And so what's the natural human reaction there? Let me keep my mouth shut. I don't want to be shunned. I don't want to be ostracized. I don't want to be, attacked by people. And those with enough gall or courage to speak out against those things, as we have seen time and time again now in the public, they're losing their jobs. They are being canceled. We've all heard the phrase cancel culture. And thankfully, there are folks now who are fighting back against that. But so to answer that question, understand that what is being experienced there is the domino effect of this greater insidious issue where we are being silenced. And when I say we, I mean everybody who takes issue with anything. So think about what a large blanket that is. Think about how serious this dilemma is. And I really hope that any college students listening will take this issue up and band together with professors on their campuses to get rid of this culture, to fight against it. Because I know that on many college campuses, there are signs out there that say, if you know anyone, including professors, who are saying this or that, report them. It's very Orwellian, the society that we live in, like George Orwell's 1984. It's a very, very interesting society we live in where now we are surveilling each other and without even necessarily realizing it. Does that answer the
Right.
question?
I think so. Yeah, I didn't see any follow up there, but no, it's
Okay.
perfect.
Wa'iyak. Okay, so going back to the main issue at hand here. And I'm going to leave with this last bit here, and we'll pick up inshallah next week. But there is something I want Muslims to hopefully understand, that within our community there are, I think, 3 different groups of or camps of feminist thinking that is going on. Okay, 3 different groups. The first group is what I call the de-Muslimized Muslims. The de-Muslimized Muslims, right? And this was me back in the day. This is the group that says Islam needs feminism because Islam is patriarchal and misogynistic. And these oftentimes happen to be the ex-Muslims. Not always, but oftentimes these are the ex-Muslims. And unfortunately, many of these individuals end up leaving Islam because of the very bad experiences they've had at the hands of Muslims. Okay? please understand that there is a difference between Islam and Muslims. We've heard it many times, and I know you're probably tired of hearing it. Islam is perfect, Muslims are not. But it's true. It is true. Okay? Islam is perfect, Muslims are not. That's why Islam exists, because Muslims are not perfect. It is a way to help guide individuals. Okay? And we will never be perfect. We will always err and fall short. And Allah created us that way so that we will be tested and return to Him and ask for forgiveness constantly. If we are going to base our opinions and our decisions on what people do, then we are going to be sore losers in the end. Do not look at Muslims to be the example of whether or not Islam is true or the right way. Study Islam. Don't study Muslims. So the first group are the de-Muslimized Muslims who think that Islam is inherently wrong and broken, and it needs feminism in order to eradicate the patriarchy upon which it is founded. The second group are the reformist Muslims. These are the Muslims who say that Islam does need feminism, but not because Islam is wrong, but because it's been interpreted by male scholars. Okay, I'm sorry, my son just woke up from a nap, so you might hear him crying in the background. These are the Muslims who say that Islam has a skewed view due to males infiltrating and taking over Islam, and that Islam is anti-woman. Some of these groups are represented by Sisters in Islam or Musawa. These are organizations you might have heard of. They identify as Muslim and feminist. Okay, and that argument has inherent problems, which I talk about in that YouTube video, so go check that out. The last group are the ambivalent Muslims. These are the Muslims who are just not sure. They say, well, maybe Islam doesn't need feminism because, yes, Islam is perfect, but because Muslims conduct themselves in poor ways, and because we share the same causes as feminists, it is Muslims, not Islam, who need feminism. Does that make sense? Please let me know if it doesn't. It is also a problem to take that position because we are turning to a solution that is not Islam. Anytime we adopt something that is inherently against Islam, we know by default it is going to end in disaster. Okay? This is just, it's a tried and true experiment in Islamic society, right? In Islamic history, rather. I'm sorry. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu reminded us that we were the most disgraceful people and Allah honored us with Islam. If we seek honor and justice from anything besides that which Allah has honored us with, then Allah will disgrace us. So let us not turn to other isms such as feminism, secularism, etc. Let us return to Islam. If Muslims have deterred so far from the Quran and the path of Islam, let us return to Islam, not look elsewhere for justice and for mercy and balance and order, because it is not in the human-made ideologies, in the human-constructed worldviews that we are going to find the answer. These worldviews are constantly changing within themselves. They have fluctuating definitions, so we cannot rely on them. Okay, so I'll end there. I know we're out of time. Forgive me for rambling on and on.
Oh, no,
Hopefully that answers some of the questions that were asked, inshallah.
That was great. Jazakallah khair. Hopefully,
Waiyak.
I hear your son stop crying, so inshallah, brother Ismail was able to take care of him.
Nope, he's taking a nap. Jazakallah khairan for your patience.
The last question from our most loyal viewer, Abu Suhaib. How to differentiate between Islam and norms and traditions when we discuss the issues of feminism?
I'm not sure I understand the question. If you could rephrase that, brother, I will more than happily try to answer your question. We'll
Okay.
Just give him a minute there.
Yeah.
And also, if there are any requests for next week's session on feminism and the direction you'd like me to go in, please let me know, because this is a very, very big topic. and you could spend years studying this issue and trying to talk about it. So what specifically about this topic would you like us to focus on next Saturday, inshallah?
All right. So can you shed some light on the concept of meninist, which seems to be an emerging response to feminism?
So I'm actually not familiar with this. Shame on me. I should. Oh, like the red pill movement? Is that men are victimized by feminism? Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So be very careful. The same way that I have just spent an hour saying, don't turn to feminism for the legitimate grievances that you have against men, right? Men also should not turn to other ideologies against their counter grievances to feminists. Okay? So it's like layer upon layer of wrong decisions here. We are constantly looking for solutions outside of Islam. So, brother, to answer your question, even if you are having this conversation with non Muslims, always the answer is to understand the Islamic worldview, to study your own religious tradition, and to know it as best as you can inside out. We are all students of knowledge, right? And we should always, whether we are talking to Muslims or non Muslims, it doesn't matter who you're talking to, you should root your arguments in the Quran. And more importantly, your behavior, your akhlaq, when you're having these conversations, should be in line with the sunnah. Because people are paying more attention to your akhlaq than your actual rational arguments. Most people, first of all, don't engage in debates, okay? Because most people are stuck in their ways, okay? Most people have already entered these conversations with their opinions. It's just an exercise in futility here. You're just flexing intellectual muscles, and nobody's really going to change their minds. The Prophet alayhi salam, right, the most perfect human being to ever walk the earth, was not able to change every heart. So be careful not to assume that you will have that ability to do so. Allah guides whom He wills. But what you can do always, and what we should do always, is perfect our akhlaq. Try to be the example that the Prophet was. People will take notice. People gravitate towards kindness. People gravitate towards mercy and balance, and those who are fair and just. And when people gravitate towards you because of those virtues that you exhibit, they're more likely to be open to Islam and its arguments and its perspective on humanity and the world. So I'll stop there because otherwise we will never be able to wrap up the session.
No, that was perfect. Jazakumullah khair, especially the part about coming back with kindness and making sure your akhlaq lines up with what Islam teaches. I think this is a great stopping point. The last two sessions that you did were overwhelmingly positively received by our community. We received great feedback. I'm sure we'll get more views and more comments on this topic. And we'll get back to you later in the week on anything else to add for next week. One thing that you may want to also focus on for next week is how this topic of feminism affects other faith-based communities, because this is something that's not just affecting us. You did cover that a little bit, but maybe expand on that a little bit more next week.
Sure.
For the rest of our community, we've got the last 10 nights of Ramadan. We've got quite a few things happening at the masjid. We're going to have daily qiyam from 2 to 3 a.m. and then the adkar 20 minutes before iftar. And then on May 7th will be the youth qiyam, which will be after Salatul Tarawih. And then we've got the 27th and 29th nights of Ramadan. We're expecting a full house, so please come in early. Isha Salah will be at 9:45, so you can get there by 9:30. That would be great. And we look forward to seeing all of you next week at 1:30 for our last session. Thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.